welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. We are talking today about knowledge management with AutoClassification. This is Sandy Serkis, who you know, who is our founder and CEO at Valora Technologies. And my name is Jen Nelson. I'm the VP of Marketing and Business Development at Valora Technologies, so welcome. For those folks who are new to Valora or may not have been here in a while, I'll just give you a bit of an introduction about who we are. Valora Technologies allows us businesses to identify, find, locate, and action content across the enterprise. And we kind of have these three pillars of Valora. The first is our technology platform. We've got an enterprise-grade, scalable SaaS platform that all the magic happens on. We have a pretty kick-butt in-house professional services and PM team that we rely on and our clients rely on for their expertise. And we also have over 20 years experience doing what we're doing, both on the technology side and also on the services and the IG side. And some of the clients that we work with, you'll probably see yourselves here in financial services and regulated industries, some in legal, some in clearinghouse. So that's kind of who we are and who we work with. Today, again, talking about knowledge management with AutoClassification. These are kind of the highlights, what we're going to get through. We're at 1:08, so I'm going to keep track of time. We're going to talk about objectives and challenges specifically that usually the KM team faces. AutoClassification for expediting content surges on behalf of, or for the KM team on behalf of others in the organization. We're going to look at some use cases, case study, and some applications of AutoClassification with KM, and then some challenges that we often see KM teams face, and then some tips also for boosting KM acceptance of the organization. And again, oh, and the last one is how to build a virtual vault. What's a virtual vault, you say? Well, you'll have to wait to the end. So stay tuned. Excellent. And as mentioned, if you've got questions, type them in and we'll answer as we go. But before I pass it off to Sandy, I'm going to pass this to Sandy in a second. Most people are familiar with Valora. If you're not, though, here's a AutoClassification in 5 minutes or less. What is AutoClassification? It is a software platform, which we will not see today, but we welcome you, invite you to book a demo if you'd like. But it is a software platform that kind of answers two questions. First, what is this thing? What is this piece of content? And what do I do with it? And it goes through a series of these algorithms to determine that. The first one is looking for and applying file enriched metadata or attributes of the file. You'll see in this little box down here, these are the system generated metadata. File type, date created, hash value, last modified date. But what we're looking for and what the software does is look deeper into both the content and the context of that document. So not only, what date was it created, but is there an expiration date? Is there a sign date? Is there a renewal date? What language is it in? Or is there, signatures? Who is the signee? Who is the signator? So it's going to pull all that rich metadata. And when it does that, it's going to use those different metadata fields to run recognition algorithms and determine the doc type. So if it has an effective date, a sign date, the word contract, the word renewal, it will make those determinations about what that doc type is. And then maybe it's a service agreement or a termination letter, whatever that is. And once it understands what the document is, and by determining doc type, then we can apply disposition algorithms, which is a rule. So if it's this, do that. If it's this and this, do that and that and that. So the automation and the workflows there with the disposition of what we want to do with it are really endless, because once you know what it is and what you want to do with it, the sky's the limit. You can kind of use it for everything. So I hope I was true to my 5 minutes or less about what AutoClassification is.
I'm thinking I give a 3-hour class on this topic, and there it is in 3 minutes. Fantastic.
Great, yeah. So Sandy, I'm going to pass the baton to you, and we're going to get into the meat of the webinar and why we're here today, talking about knowledge management with AutoClassification.
Great. Again, let me welcome everybody. We've had quite a few more people join, so we encourage you to participate and ask questions. And if there's something you want to know or you want more detail on, just pop that into the chat area and we'll be sure to get to it. So today's webinar really focuses on knowledge management. And there are a lot of different views on what exactly knowledge management is. It's something very specific inside a law firm, and I know we have a number of law firm folks on this call today. And it's also something very specific in, large organizations that have big R&D components. And then it's yet something else to organizations that do not fit either of those categories. So I'm going to be using kind of the broadest possible interpretation of knowledge management. This is a lovely graphic that I'm not sure where Jen found, but I thought it was a really fantastic definition, really, of what knowledge management is. And I will share with you the official definition from KM World, who really ought to know. This is their definition. Knowledge management is a discipline that promotes an integrated approach to identifying, capturing, evaluating, retrieving, and sharing all of an enterprise's information assets. And so you'll see that kind of framework, those action verbs over here on the left. But personally, I think the most important word in that definition is the word all of an enterprise's information assets. Because in my interactions and conversations with knowledge management, I've sometimes seen a more limited view. There's only that content which has been sort of designated for KM purposes, and everything else is sort of like, la, 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 I don't see it, I don't know about it. And that is, in our opinion here at Valora, not the best position to take. Knowledge and information is everywhere. It could just as easily be in an email as in some sort of expert system. And so we, again, are taking the broad view of enterprise content as a whole and addressing solutions to the full picture. So that kind of takes us into what we would call the KM spectrum of needs, which is definitely consulting speak that I stole from somebody. But what it really means is kind of looking at the types of people, and you can kind of see these going down on the left, different folks that interact with the discipline of knowledge management and the activities that they're trying to accomplish going across. And what we see over and over and over again is the poor knowledge management director or whoever's the head of knowledge management having to kind of be responsible for it all at any given moment, often with limited or no staff and limited or no budget. It's not an enviable position, and it's very reminiscent. I know some of you on the call today are records managers or information governance folks in your organizations. It's very reminiscent of that. In fact, we're going to talk in a few minutes about the kind of evolution of business thinking around some of these areas. And I would advise the KM folks to pay particular note to what's been going on in information governance. Not only are your disciplines kind of very similar, but there's been kind of a renaissance over in IG that I think is just starting in KM. We're going to cover that in a minute. In the meantime, this is more or less what the lay of the land looks like. Who's the person and what are they being asked to do, right or wrong? And of course, the KM manager is trying to do it all the time. What we kind of envision and what we try to assist our clients with is a more ideal way of parceling out this and trying to eliminate tasks for people who either aren't really very qualified to perform them, don't really want to perform them, or there are easier methods than having to rely on people to do them. And so those you see represented here in the try to eliminate category, not eliminate the person, eliminate them having to do this task. For example, KM folks shouldn't really be responsible for migrating content, and IT people shouldn't really be responsible for providing disposition on content. That's kind of a fundamental mismatch. So what we are always looking to do is to kind of codify the decision-making, the rules, the techniques inside software to take that burden off of individuals. That's the whole sort of Valora way. Okay, so I mentioned this a moment ago that there are quite a few similarities to other information disciplines, and I wanted to share that with you. Once upon a time, maybe 2013, 2014, I kind of embarked on this mission to understand the similarities and overlap between e-discovery and records management. I think that I and many others were quite successful in finding just how similar those disciplines are. And now I think the same thing is happening with KM kind of entering that picture. So KM folks, I'd like to share with you the benefit of what we've learned at looking at these very related disciplines that are also incredibly reliant on the proper, I'll call it, curation of information. Another one, kind of Johnny come lately, is data privacy, also having the same kind of needs of what is this content? What does it mean? What's the obligation? How do we handle it? Very similar. They're different viewpoints, but the effort and the kind of objectives are very, very similar. So let's walk through that a little bit. In e-discovery, and I'm just talking about kind of the primary goal. The primary goal is regarding information analysis and retrieval is to find information that's related or potentially related to a discovery matter. So if you think of all of these as some form of data request, a litigation one simply called production request, but the need is the same. It's go through a bunch of content, try to narrow it down by these issues, and pull out, if possible, that which is relevant or responsive to the litigation demands. That's the effort in e-discovery. The effort in data privacy, again, it's going to sound similar. It's to respond to a DSAR, which if you're not familiar with GDPR lingo, that's a data subject access request. It's fancy acronym for an employee or maybe a client or supplier saying, I'd like to know what information you have on me, please. And under European law, I have a right to know. And increasingly so in the United States. I won't get into all the gajillions of privacy regulation. Those of you who need to know that stuff, I'm sure, are following it very carefully. The upshot is the subject access request comes in, and then the data request takes place, very similar to what I just described for litigation. So this time, the request is going to be based around almost certainly people's names, their personal data, and in many cases, the document type. I'd like my my performance review, please. I'd like my tax filings, please. So you hear kind of document type coming out in that. Retention, which really we mean kind of records retention, content lifecycle, is again, similarly assessing content, going through content and performing data requests. They may not use that phrase, but it's what they're doing to determine what is a record, what is not a record, what do we need to keep, how long do we need to keep it, are we past the amount of time that we need to keep it. All of that is kind of loosely retention. And what we call system of record, because there's kind of officialness to records in a way that is not necessarily applied to other content. So that is retention sort of objective. And then there's classification kind of in isolation, if you want to think about it that way, which is really on the objective of what is this content? Because a lot of times people don't know. It's email. Well, what's that? That could be anything. What's in that old file share? What's in that archive? What's in our DMS? And so classification is really trying to answer that question of what is this? And one of the key reasons people are doing that is to try and identify and remove rot. If you're not familiar with rot, it's redundant, obsolete, trivial. Stuff that's old, stuff that's pointless, stuff that's duplicative, okay? So each of these has kind of a different viewpoint, but their tasks and their efforts are very, very similar. Why do we mention this? Because each one of these can benefit from the others, both in learning and of course later in budget sharing. So we have what we would call kind of shared practice and learnings. KM, pay attention. A lot of these groups, particularly discovery and increasingly so records, have solved some of the problems around managing, curating, disposing of content. They understand kind of how the systems work. They have been able to secure resources in the form of personnel, budgets, executive attention, And again, my work with KM folks suggests that those latter ones, attention and budget, are difficult perennial problems for KM. KM often gets kind of shoved aside as a nice to have as opposed to a have to have. And we're going to give you some strategies today because records management absolutely used to be in that category and is pretty well successfully rebranding itself into a more influential, more important, more budget-worthy area. And we think that KM can kind of follow the same playbook. So this is what I kind of alluded to earlier. There has been kind of an evolution of these practice areas from non-digital to digital. Good on the litigation world that coined this nifty little term, e-discovery, E standing for electronic, was very prescient way back in 2006. Records retention has been on its rebranding since roughly 2013 into information governance. That also was a very smart move because they went from records, which are often associated as paper only, into information, which took them front and center into electronic. I would advise in the knowledge management world, knowledge tends to feel very cerebral. I think knowledge management needs a kind of more E or info or digital type branding. I don't have that answer for you, but please have at it, smart people. Let's see some of those comment suggestions. And then I'd also point you towards data privacy, which once upon a time was called data protection. Not the world's best rebranding, but it has been successful in getting our attention because of GDPR going into effect in 2016. And that really kind of opened the world's eyes to this concept and the notion that what you hold matters. I think KM has always known this, but they were sometimes preaching to the wind instead of to the organization. And this is, again, why I suggest you kind of get on board with your brethren here. We're going to talk more about this at the end. And Jen, just before I dive really in, any questions come up so far? Because I'm not really tracking.
Yeah, no, not yet. I'll let you know.
Okay. So, you know, I've kind of alluded to some of the challenges that KM kind of typically or sort of perennially faces. We're going to kind of outline some of those specifically and to give you some tips on how to deal with that. And then, of course, we're sort of arcing towards what are some of the technological solutions. Obviously, we have a lot to say on that topic. So in no particular order, one of the kind of, I would say, stumbling blocks for knowledge management is that it relies heavily on contributor goodwill. In other words, the smart people in your organization to, one, share their knowledge, sometimes just as experts, and that's all they do, sometimes in the form of curating content for other people's use, and sometimes to just identify sources or locations of information that might be of use someday. That's all well and good, assuming the contributors want to play ball. If they don't, then it becomes quite a struggle. It's also difficult, even in the best case, you have contributors who are ready, willing, and able to do this, and then they sort of graduate the system. They retire, they depart, they become more senior and aren't doing that anymore. And suddenly that active party is no longer available to you. That is not what we would consider kind of sustainable information management. And so we would kind of recommend that you take whatever steps you can to get the smarts away from the individuals and into systems instead. Similarly, relying on people, and the first one, it was kind of the goodwill aspect. This second one, it's more is that people make mistakes. Classifying content by hand, I should know, is quite difficult and tedious. And it really, in the best of circumstances, is going to result in some kind of junky results. And junky results are in many ways worse than no results, because junky results can be misleading. They might hide information. They might provide bias. And so it's generally considered not the best approach to have people classifying information. Can they do it? Of course. Can they be good at it? Of course. But again, not sustainable, not reliable over time, and certainly not suitable for the kinds of volume that we're all seeing today. I didn't start this presentation like so many of these start with, there are 2 terabytes being made every 0.6 seconds. We all know that already. I don't have to tell you that we're drowning in data. You know it. And so again, relying on people is a little bit like, kind of standing outside in a hurricane with an umbrella going, yeah, I'm okay. No, you're not. And so relying on people really is not going to be the answer if it ever was. Another thing that happens, and I hear this a lot with KM people, is of course content ages. And in KM, that content is so critical. It's important that that content be up to date, that it be reliable, that it be, in many cases, the latest version, the most, understood best practice. And so the notion that content ages is tricky for KM, because after they've done all that work to curate and all that work to kind of enlist people's help, time goes by, now all of that is kind of aging out. And so it has to keep, perpetually being updated. Again, systems are a better choice for perpetually aging content. The ROI is a big one, I think, for KM, the way it was for records. E-discovery kind of gets away with a lot because the ROI is really, well, if we don't do it, we're going to get sued, or if we don't do this, we're going to lose the matter. That's a pretty good ROI. Records and KM are both in the what's the kind of soft cost area of ROI. We do have a lot of tools. We have some ROI calculators that we'd be happy to share with you all that kind of compare the manual effort of doing some of these things against an automated effort of doing these things. Counting, of course, in the manual world, the cost of labor, the cost of time and impact, and in the sort of systems world, the cost of the systems as, against the savings in time and the reduction of risk. And that's one kind of hint I'll give you right now, which is if you can add a risk element into your ROI, you're going to find it very easy to make the numbers work out. That has proven to be the absolute trick in records management, to be able to explain the downside, the risk of improper records management. One of them is, of course, stuff not being thrown away. Now it's discoverable. Now you're in trouble at litigation time. That's a relatively easy path. For KM, it's a little trickier because you do want to hang on to that knowledge. Presumably, it's the organization's jewels. That's the point. But if it's not properly kind of managed or classified or tagged or kept up to date, then you can make the argument that nobody knows how to get to the jewels or utilize the jewels. So those in pursuit of it are kind of an ill-fated quest to get poetic on you. But there are ways to kind of prove the inefficiency and the expense of having to dig and either take forever to find something, or worse, having to recreate it. So again, we have a lot of that kind of ROI work behind the scenes. Just let us know if you'd like to see that. I mentioned this right at the very beginning. I find that sometimes KM folks are like, this is my domain and this is all I see and I will curate the heck out of it. That's fine, but there is value everywhere else that may kind of play to your strengths, that needs to be curated, that needs to be managed, and that needs to have somebody with a clue kind of looking at it. So KM, you can sort of expand your domain if you expand the type of content that you're going to think about. This one is, I feel a struggle often with KM folks about whether or not to enable people in their organization to self-serve, or whether they want to continue being the sole gatekeeper. Now, part of the reason that KM people are gatekeepers is because they're the ones spending all day, every day in the content. They know exactly what it is, where it is, and they've very often come up with these gorgeous taxonomies for managing that. That kind of elevates them to almost like guru on a mountain kind of status, and that people in the organization then come to them and say, oh, guru, please help me find. And that's nice and that's wonderful, but what happens when that guru needs to move on in some way? Well, where does that information go? How does that get pass through to the organization? And more importantly, how is that going to kind of propagate throughout the organization if you want to grow, if you want to take on other value sources, if you acquire another organization, if you would like to do something other than just be guru? So I kind of challenged the KM folks out there to think about what would happen in your organization if you retired tomorrow. Where would this organization be? Is that information being pushed into systems and processized, or is it all in your head? And then finally, we're going to kind of cover this a little bit later as well. Out of all the disciplines we've talked about so far, KM has the most need to rank the information. So what do I mean by that? I mean, not just say, well, this is a letter and it's from Jen to Sandy and it's dated, last Tuesday. That's all kind of factual, what I would call first order information. What KM is looking to do is rank information on how valuable is that letter. Well, it depends what it says. It depends who wrote it. It depends who it's to. It depends what this company does. So we're getting into both content and context. And so this is what automated systems do best. And so to try and ease the burden that's on those knowledge management folks, instead of sitting there and having to classify what the thing is and then therefore how valuable it is, that is where the systems shine. Let them work for you. And then finally, this is a tip. This is just a straight up tip, which is there are two views of enterprise information. And of course, neither one is right in the absence of the other. Information is, of course, an asset. That's a very KM forward kind of argument. But information is also a risk. That's a very legal forward type of argument. But here's the big thing. Dollars go to risk, point blank. Why? Because people are more afraid of risk than they gain from having assets. It's a sad state of affairs, but it's the truth. And so what I would recommend for KM folks that might be fighting for budget or not legitimacy, but like kind of acceptance up at the C-suite is that you focus in the same way the records has on the downside risks of not having your information organized in a perpetual manner. All right. So now we're going to get into, okay, Sandy, I'm with you. How can we benefit from auto-classification? So I'm going to walk you through an example of a global pharma. I think that this is a very almost stereotypical example, not just in that vertical, but for kind of organizations in general. So this is what this client's KM, they very much considered a KM universe, was. They had 4 or 5 different repositories of information, thousands of employees contributing over the last decade and a half. And it was just this like unbelievable mountain. This organization, like many large global companies, grows by acquisition. So just when they'd get their arms around something, they'd inherit 3 more. And so this is sort of a perpetual kind of keeps getting away from them kind of story. The KM team, in my recollection, was 2 people. Very limited budget, but very large responsibility. This is an R&D organization after all. So what was the impact of this? There was basically no centralized control. They had very poor attribute tagging. They had just a phenomenal, glorious taxonomy, but your average layperson just couldn't follow that, didn't even know it was out there. And nobody was really tagging anything, and they completely relied on search for absolutely everything. And they quickly understood, and I have many presentations on this, on just searching for a phrase you're looking for is going to return thousands, millions of hits that you don't care about. There needs to be a more intelligent technique, and that's what tagging brings to the table. The other thing that was happening is, of course, their information governance team had written policies. There are many regulations on pharmaceuticals on how content is supposed to be managed and stored and used, and they were failing those audits because, again, understaffed, just didn't have the kind of capability. And the frustration in the KM group was palpable. constantly having to prove the value of their team and their mission and what they were doing. And so they cleverly sensed the opportunity that as their organization was moving more and more to the cloud, that it was a golden opportunity to get control of their content in a way that was not possible before. Because they could make, here's another ROI technique, they could make the argument that it wasn't worth migrating absolutely everything over to the cloud, that you could be more selective about that, and that the crown jewels should migrate and the garbage should not. So again, overtones of records management and IG here, but this was firmly a KM group with a KM viewpoint on life. And the way they sold it was being able to reduce that IT burden. Ultimately, these were the questions that they were looking to do. I tried to kind of capture their words as much as possible, what they were looking for in a solution. So this is a pretty good, I think, kind of synopsis of a KM need and a KM approach. And so this is how we kind of address these needs with AutoClassification. Like almost everything, we start with a pilot. I would highly recommend when you're evaluating technological solutions that you start with a pilot. A pilot is a small, it should be completely, mostly, if not entirely, kind of feature complete, but maybe work on a small set of data. Or if you have, the world's biggest taxonomy, maybe the first third, something like that. Enough to show you that it works, but not enough that you're doing the whole project as a pilot. In Valora's world, we typically do pilots in about 3 months. We recommend what we call core samples. In other words, dig down through various content stores, generally on the order of 20 to 30 gigabytes. That's usually enough to kind of forecast the rest, and do a quick, easy analysis. What is this? How does it match against the taxonomy? How does it match in terms of duplication? What type of hardware was needed to chunk through that? So it's just kind of forecasting and predicting in every possible direction so that you can essentially think about the whole mountain of work and how long it'll take, what kind of budget, what kind of systems you'll need, what kind of staff, etc. So that's a pilot, and we kind of, the goal being build knowledge fast. Then once you have that, what we typically do is bridge, which is also known as scale. So start from the pilot, add the rest of the features so it is feature complete. Move it into, if it's going to be running in different countries because of cross-border issues, or if there need to be API connectors to hook up to various systems, that's when all of that's coming into play. And usually a bridge, that is where you're scaling from pilot to full, it's going to be in a 3 to 9 month kind of window. And then off to the races. And so just to explain, most systems, Valora's included, are doing kind of a base run of the content. What do we got? Make a base level kind of index of all of that. And then from there on out, only do what we call delta monitoring, which is anything that's changed, anything that's new. So that's a combination of new content. It could be a new sort of what we call configuration. You want new fields, you want new rules, or it could be new context. Oh, there's new regulation which we have to account for. Oh, now we're operating in blah, blah country, which we now have to account for. Whatever it is that is the change, it's not only changes in data. So that's what kind of the implementation looks like, very typical, very standard. For those of you who were looking for a quick, 1 week, 1 month fix, I'm sorry to disappoint. It took, in this case, this organization 20 years to accumulate this information. It is taking about a year to, kind of press through it. Can it go faster? Yes. It's a question of trade-off between hardware and essentially cost and speed. And so, those are always true with any kind of analysis system. The end result, after running through at least, the baseline, is that KM gets into what we call a virtual vault. So what's a virtual vault? It's essentially a front-end user interface, what we call a single pane of glass, that is looking across the content stored all across the organization, on-prem, in the cloud, this country, that country, email system, DMS, you name it. It's having that front end single pane of glass that is looking at the world holistically, and then being able to dive down on any data facet of interest. Location might be one of them, but it might be the topic area or the document type or the author or the custodian or the aging of that content or the sensitivity of that content. Again, the search, that data retrieval aspect can be on any combination of data facets. What it ultimately comes to, and this is sometimes a novel concept for KM folks, is that your taxonomy becomes more about attribute tagging and less about physical location. A lot of taxonomies are set up as folder structures, and each kind of subfolder is some element of nuance. So maybe you have a folder called countries, and then you have Argentina, Africa, blah, 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 all the way down like that. That is a taxonomy that is manifesting as folder path. What would be more clever and is more kind of classification 2.0 is to have country be a tag, Argentina, Africa, Belgium, whatever, and then have that tag be a searchable item so that you don't have to know, oh, I find the geography folder, and then I follow down to country, then to city, where if your search parameter just says, give me everything from Belgium. That is what I mean by a tagging taxonomy as opposed to a location, meaning a file folder location taxonomy. It also, actually, just to go back there, it also helps identify content that's in the wrong place, because that happens every minute of every day. If you only know the proper way to follow a folder-based taxonomy, you will not know that that same content exists somewhere else. If you can retrieve it based on the tag, and it comes up and you see 16 copies, and you're like, what are those that have been misfiled? I'll give an example of a horror story that we had with one client that really had a kind of folder-based taxonomy. They are tracking HR records from acquisitions. They acquire about 4 or 5 companies every quarter. And they somehow, somewhere, one acquisition got filed under another. And so they thought, not all of it, just some of it, they thought everything they had was under this acquisition. They've been searching on it, discovery, you know, DSARs, you name it. And then when we started running our software, we said, you know, this acquisition is hidden under that one. And they went, what? Because nobody thought to look in the other acquisition for this acquisition's data. It's a weird thing. Why would you think of that? And they have over 150 acquisitions. We're going to check every one every time. So this kind of helped bring to light what I'm sure was an honest human error. Somebody copied it to the wrong place. It happens. And so it's just sort of an example of where kind of relying on a folder-based structure entirely, not always the best idea, whereas a tagging-based structure will help find that kind of thing. And Jen, that's a horror story because I know you need one later today. So there you go. Creepy. Okay, so how does a virtual vault work? Most of you have seen variations on this theme before, but this is what the software is doing. It is essentially crawling a content store, either directly or with an agent. Agents are just little software things that have read-only access. They just look and go, what you got there? Okay, I'll be leaving now. That's what agents do. Then they go through and identify and tag what is this thing. It's a kind of pretty rich process. Typically, we tag for about maybe 30 to 50 fields. Everything from the simplest, what language is it in, onto the most complex, you know, what's the product subcode, you know, whatever it is that is germane to that client. Analyze and understand, you know, first of all, what is the thing? And then what is it contextually? What am I looking at? What do I need to do with this? Why do I care? And in the case of KM, this is where that value proposition, how important is this information? I know it mentions the product name, but is it mentioning it because this is the secret formula or because this is a brochure that we hand out at a trade show? Okay, both of them are going to come up in a search with the name of the product. One of them is way more value in a knowledge system than the other. And so deciding and actioning, this is where I would put that ranking of content. It's incredibly important, it's mildly important, it's not important. This is different than rot. I don't mean it's junk. I mean just in terms of importance to what a typical KM organization is looking for. And then of course that delta monitoring. So this is what the software systems are doing. These are content analytical systems. So yes, there needs to be some content for them to work on. And if there isn't, yes, we'll run OCR. There has to be some sort of physical characters for that to work. If you deal entirely in pictures, probably a content analysis system is not the right one for you, but most of us deal in textual communications, and it's great for that. So this is to help you think about whether or not you might need a virtual vault. Is our content everywhere? And if somebody says no on this call, I'd love a tour of your organization, but that's not the case. Can we find what we need? Some organizations are insanely good at search, which, you know, God bless them, but that's becoming a harder and harder task. And here's the real thing. You could find it after 3 days. Yeah, great. Can you do it efficiently? By which we mean cost effectively in a certain amount of turn time. Can a small KM group provide returns to people as fast as the people are asking for them? Is there stuff we're missing? I gave that great example. Is this the right one? This happens a lot. People can find something, but they have a sneaky suspicion that there's a different version or a later one, and the one they did last week, where is that? Is there any risk to this content? Should we have it? Might it be under legal hold? Is it past retention? Is it highly sensitive and shouldn't just be floating out there, even in a KM system? I don't think KM thinks that much in terms of kind of sensitivity of content. I think they think in terms of value of content, but more and more sensitivity is entering the picture, particularly regarding access. Who is allowed to know about that content? Who's allowed to retrieve it or read it? It might be super valuable, but not everybody gets that privilege. This is a big one. How often are you performing similar searches? If the answer is all the time, you're ripe for automation. And then finally, is it just you or is it everybody needing this? That's, again, where you're going to build that consensus, that ROI. If it's just your time being saved, it might just suck to be you. But if you're able to save lots of people's time, then you are a hero. These, I'm not going to get into every one of these. These are some what I would call kind of advanced topics that you might want to solidify either with your IT team, with your information governance team, potentially with legal. If you are contemplating using AutoClassification and implementing, you will have to address these questions sooner or later. So this is kind of meant to be a little checklist for you to go through and make sure you kind of have an idea what the answer to these will be. And as you start to scope out, I know some of you go through formal RFP processes or your kind of solution vendor vetting, make sure you have kind of a preferred answer to these things, because you're going to turn around, or you should, and address this to the potential solution provider and say, well, okay, solution provider, what do you recommend, or what have you done in the past? So here's a little checklist for you to take with you to make sure you have kind of preferred answers to. And so that takes us in the last sort of 10 minutes or so into what I think KM's future really is going to be. As we said, KM is at this just terrific inflection point right now. As the world is going digital, KM in some ways has always been digital, but hasn't always been appreciated. And I have to say, KM, I think this is your moment. And so what I would sort of challenge some of you to is, where does KM stop and other disciplines begin? I spent a lot of time on this webinar talking about some of these other disciplines and how they have successfully transitioned to kind of a modern era, including tools and budgets and support and resources. And so where is KM, where is the line between them? And specifically, what's the difference between curating content, in other words, adding tags, making sure you know what it is, versus responsibility for that content? And we've seen both flavors of this. We've seen some KM groups are like, it's just my job to know what the content is. It's not my job to decide whether or not it's under legal hold or it's, you know, germane to this litigation or not. That's your problem, legal. Similarly, we've seen information governance people literally utter the phrase, I don't care what the content is, I just care how old it is. Like, both of those are really, really flawed. They're both ignoring context, and it's a mistake. Eventually, these are going to collide. So what I would recommend is that you all get on board. Who needs to know what it says? All of you need to know what it says. You just have different reasons for that, which means you can all share a system and stop battling each other with your ideas and your systems and your budgets, and why not get together by one good system that suits you all. That will be the most cost effective and the most likely to get everybody on board if all these organizations are kind of preaching together instead of against each other. To give you an example, what is the primary need? Privacy is going to be looking, is it sensitive? Legal, is it relevant? Is it responsive? Do I have to produce it? Records management, is it past retention? Knowledge management, as I said, you have this second order effort. You need to write the information in a way that the others don't. They need to just kind of answer the yes, no question. You need to answer the how much question. And so in some ways, knowledge management, don't tell the other groups I said this, but in some ways, knowledge management could be driving this whole bus if you wanted to be, because you are the appreciators of the value of information, not just that it exists or doesn't, or meets a criteria or doesn't. You know how important that document is to the organization versus not. So I would kind of suggest you parlay that advantage into that's how you gain that influence, that's how you get the budget, because your needs are almost a second order above everybody else's. I wouldn't quite phrase it that way, that's just me and you talking, KM, but you get the point. And then this is kind of the last thing I'll leave you with, which is that I think that KM tends to be reactive. They built their practice area by responding to requests. Hey, KM, I'm looking for information on blah. I'm looking for products we used to have that do blah. I'm looking for competitive info on blah. And so they're reacting to those data requests. When you're using software to both tag and fulfill the data requests, you have kind of a historical record of that activity. And you can also very easily say, you know, this is a search I ran 3 months ago for so-and-so on this topic, and whoa, here's a new piece of information that we subscribe to. It showed up, and it totally fits the bill of that. Instead of having you have to remember because you've done 72 searches since then, the system remembers and goes, ooh, Susie would really like this. I'll just bash it off to her, shall I? Okay, this is what these systems can do, become proactive, either on a kind of unit file, unit document basis, or I'm going to switch over to the third one here, on a cadence. Susie, I'm going to collect this kind of information for you, and every 90 days I'm going to send you a summary, or I'm going to send you a link to the things that have accumulated in your domain area. Again, software just does this as a matter of course. It's doing it anyway. It's just a small matter to take that and just send it in an email or in a text or what have you. And this is the difference. Again, to have KM be proactive, to stay in front of Susie, stay in front of that group that once asked you for something, you can keep coming back and going, is it, you looking for more? I noticed you needed this. This is up your alley. And that's a way to kind of continue mind share, to keep adding value long after the initial ask. And then finally, I'll come back to this one in the middle. I think KM is in a brilliant spot to identify problems. How do you identify problems? You look for patterns that don't fit. This report comes out every 30 days. As a matter of course, we file it in the KM system. But what about the time it didn't come out? Who knows that didn't come out? You do. And that, again, it could be completely automated. It's, the first of the new month and we don't have August's report. Where is it? Immediately issue the alert and say, here are the reports to date, missing August. What do you want to do, boss? And so that's what I mean to be proactive in terms of content, in terms of applicability, in terms of cadence, and in terms of error conditions. Because a proper analysis of content should be able to find those as soon as they happen. There are many other variations on this theme. Again, reach out to me or Jen. We'd be happy to talk you through some essentially kind of proactive conflict resolutions, kind of being able to find things before they become an issue. So that is really kind of the end of what we're covering today about KM and auto classification.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for the presentation, and thank you everyone for attending, and we will see you next time.